Okay, we are recording.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Well, welcome everybody to the webinar. Just want to confirm, Kyle, can you see our presenter mode screen in full view?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, great. All right, guys. Well, thanks for joining. My name is Zach Fierstadt. I'm from Lightcrest. I'm one of the principals here and head up business development. Today, we wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about HIPAA compliance as it pertains to modern cloud architectures and perhaps some things that you can look out for and watch out for as you're planning for a HIPAA compliant technology footprint, and more specifically cloud footprint. So a little bit about me. I've been with Lightcrest since the inception of the company in 2008. My background is primarily in software engineering and systems and network architecture. As I mentioned, I head up business development here at Lightcrest. I'm also heavily involved with the sales engineering processes and helping folks to get educated on how to map their compliance regimes onto their cloud infrastructure. So, what is HIPAA? I know most of you folks are probably already familiar with HIPAA to some degree, but I just wanted to give a kind of blanket definition before we get started for some of the folks who may not be as familiar with the body of standards. So HIPAA is essentially the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It was passed by Congress in '96, basically to establish a body of standards to increase health insurance continuity and reduce fraud and streamline the process for maintaining electronic protected health information, or EPHI. HIPAA is a pretty broad body of standards, and today we're only going to be focusing on technology, infrastructure, and management services as they pertain to security provision of Title II. Okay, so mainly we're going to be concerned about the security aspects of maintaining, storing, transmitting EPHI, and assisting customers with an architecture and a set of best practices for passing an audit at the technology level and at the infrastructure level. A little bit about how that ties into Lightcrest, just before we get too deep into the weeds here. Lightcrest as a company is essentially a software and services company, right? So what we do is we've built a hyper-converged cloud product called Kahu, which is essentially a software-defined data center platform for building bespoke cloud environments in private and hybrid cloud architectures. And coupled with that, we have our services arm, which is called full stack engineering, or full stack engineering services. And that is a layer of expertise that we layer onto our clouds to have our clients lean on us so that they can focus on software development, and we can help them with things like compliance adherence, architecting for HIPAA, maintaining security best practices, and managing high availability. So with that in mind, I wanted to talk a little bit about who's required to adhere to HIPAA in the first place, right? You might be wondering, am I supposed to be HIPAA compliant? It's kind of in my roadmap. I'm not sure if it's something that's binding yet. Who's required to be to adhere to HIPAA? So basically, the way it works is anyone who's a covered entity, what's called a covered entity, must adhere to the HIPAA body of standards, and this includes healthcare clearinghouses, it includes healthcare plans, includes healthcare providers, and even if you don't fall into a category, into the category as quote-unquote covered entity, you may still be required to adhere to HIPAA standards if your organization provides services to a covered entity as a business associate, right? While HIPAA business associates usually have less total EPHI, and remember that's the private healthcare information that we're really trying to protect, or private sensitive data that we're trying to keep secure. Even though you might have less of it, if you are providing services as a business associate to a covered entity, the full force of HIPAA requirements still apply to you, right? So it's really important that you cover your bases, even if you are sort of a middleman in the sort of data flow, right? So if even if it's not your data, if you're handling it, chances are you're going to have HIPAA compliant architectures. So before we dive into some of the detailed reasons why we think private cloud is quite conducive to HIPAA in general, in terms of deploying the HIPAA compliant infrastructure, in terms of maintaining an efficient systems and network operation around applications that are required to be HIPAA compliant, I wanted to kind of define what a private cloud actually is. So in broad strokes, a private cloud is a single tenant infrastructure platform that allows the end user to essentially consume cloud resources in an on-demand fashion, right? So the promise of the cloud in general, whether you're thinking about public or private, is this sort of ability to abstract away the infrastructure, push a button or call an API endpoint, and boom, out pops virtual machines and storage and cloud services for object storage and machine learning and you name it, right? The fundamental premise is instead of having to rack a server up every single time you want to deploy an application, you essentially have this bag of resources that you can consume on the fly. You can scale up and down. You can adjust resources dynamically. You can modify the way your application infrastructure is sized relative to load. All those beautiful, elastic and on-demand things that you associate with cloud are sort of what the main vendors have been pushing and espousing as the future.
Hey, Zach.
Yeah.
We're still on slide 1.
Really?
Yes.
I changed the slides. That's really strange. 1 second.
That's changing now.
Okay. Yeah, it's really strange. I'm in presenter mode and I'm changing slides. Let me try to start over again. Kyle, can you see what slide do you see now, Kyle?
I see what is a private cloud.
Okay. Yeah, nothing's changed. That's really strange. I'm going to change it again just to test. Can you see this change?
No.
Okay. I don't know what's going on. Hang on.
Now it's changed.
Okay. So I haven't changed it. I haven't changed anything. So can you just go ahead, Kyle, and let me know if the slides stop changing?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. All right, thanks for letting me know. Okay, so anyway, so back to what I was talking about with private cloud. The fundamental difference with private cloud over public cloud is single tenancy and dedicated infrastructure, right? So with a private cloud, you have essentially a dedicated set of hardware resources, whether they be commodity servers or data storage, or proprietary load balancers combined with proprietary backend infrastructure. It's all dedicated to you and it's single tenant, right? And it's virtualized so that you can consume it just like you would a public cloud with VMs at the push of a button, automated deployments, push button application tear down and turn up. But the infrastructure is 100% dedicated to you, and there's a big set of implications for that, or a very important set of implications for that as it pertains to performance and security. And I want to dive into some of that stuff. So I want to juxtapose private and public cloud as to kind of draw a backdrop as it pertains to HIPAA. Kyle, can you see the slide change now, public versus private cloud?
Give it a sec.
Yes, you can. You can see it?
Not yet. It's changed.
Okay, I'm just going to keep this in presenter mode because I don't know why you're not seeing the differences. Anyway, so public cloud versus private cloud. Let's talk a little bit about the differences. As I mentioned, in the private cloud, you have a dedicated single-tenant infrastructure. You're not sharing that infrastructure with any other customers but you. You're the only organization on that cloud. Contrasted with public cloud, in a public cloud, let's say we're talking about Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure, for example. All the infrastructure is fundamentally shared with other organizations. So if you are on 100 virtual machines in AWS, the underlying hypervisors serving up that cloud are also harboring other organizations. And there's implications there. And we should talk about those implications because it's important for you to know that while public cloud is sort of being touted as, in many respects, the gold standard of cloud computing, it's really not when you're looking at fundamental attributes. One of those attributes is security. So one thing to keep in mind is in the public cloud, you don't have to worry so much about where am I going to get my next physical hardware allocation, where am I going to get my how long is it going to take me to rack up my next server, because that's all abstracted away from you. But you do have to worry about what is my neighbor's security policy, right? Because just because you've adhered to great security policies in your virtual machines doesn't mean your neighbor has. And it doesn't matter how much you've narrowed down your attack surface on your your virtual machines, whether it's your OS patching or your zero-day exploit exposure, or it's your encryption selections, or whatever choices you've made, you are still going to be impacted by your neighbor's lax security policies. And the reason that is because if your neighbor on your, let's say you're on Amazon Web Services and you have a neighbor who is failing to patch their operating systems, they have really poor network controls, etc. If their virtual machine gets compromised, the hypervisor that you share with them is impacted in one of many ways, many attack vectors at that point, right? So if your neighbor's VM is rooted, they have root compromise, whatever, there are attacks now where you can actually circumvent the underlying hypervisor and actually tamper or destroy the data on the hypervisor. And for those of you that that don't know the term, hypervisor is essentially the foundation for the virtual machines that you need the hypervisor to run the VM. So if they destroy the hypervisor, your VM is fundamentally destroyed. They can also do things like break into neighboring virtual machines once they've bounced into the hypervisor and gained access to the underlying controls to reboot VMs and boot into single user mode and things like that. And they can also do things that while they don't necessarily result in data loss or circumvention, they can do things like DDoS attacks, where once their VM is compromised, it's used as a member of a botnet, and then all your VMs become unusable, right? Because they're just consuming all the network I/O and throughput. So there's obviously ways to mitigate that, but it's a very different approach, and it tends to be costly to mitigate that because you need to have infrastructure in place to sort of automatically account for the fact that none of your VMs are essentially masters of their own domain. So private cloud tends to be a much better choice if you have really stringent, tight security controls. And we'll dive into that a bit some more in a while. So performance consistency. Now, for those of you who have signed up to hear about HIPAA, you might be asking yourselves, well, why do I care about performance? Well, yeah, I mean, HIPAA compliance doesn't necessarily mandate the fastest applications in the world, but it does. it doesn't matter. You're not going to want to stay in a security specialized cloud environment if all your applications are slow and your users are leaving in droves because your app is slow. So one major difference in the private cloud here is the entire cloud is dedicated to you, right? Unlike the public cloud, where in something like, again, AWS or Azure, you are sharing infrastructure with many other organizations, and you have this concept of noisy neighbors, and you have this concept of stolen CPU cycles, starved I/O, and things of that nature. Fundamentally what it means is, in the public cloud, you have no performance guarantees. If your neighbors start consuming lots of network throughput, if they start consuming lots of I/O on the underlying SSDs, if they start stealing CPU cycles, your application is going to be impacted. So a little bit about information assurance. So what does information assurance mean, right? So information assurance is essentially knowing exactly where your data lives at all times. I mean physically, right? So where does my data actually live? If I'm deployed in Amazon Web Services and their availability zone on the East Coast and wherever, I might know approximately what city I'm in. But that's about it. I don't know what rack, what data center, what server and what rack, who's had access to it, right? Information assurance is really about knowing where does your data physically live and who actually has access to it, what personnel. And this is something that the federal government is really big on for obvious reasons, right? They need to know who's had access to sensitive data. And when folks who are in the business of being, folks who service covered entities, who have private EPHI, who need EPHI protected, who need HIPAA compliance, when they're out in the field selling their software, their customers want to know, is my data safe? Can I tell my customers my data is safe? It's hard to do that in the public cloud. The reason is the whole premise of public cloud is that all this infrastructure is abstracted away from you, and you have the ease of sort of just I'll throw all my data in Amazon S3, and it'll just kind of go into this sort of mist, and it'll be there, and I know it'll be there, but I don't know where it is, but it's kind of there. And when I spin up a VM, I know it's approximately in Oregon somewhere or Tokyo, whatever, but I don't really know exactly where it is. Information assurance means I can pull up an audit trail of all the timestamps, down to the hour, day, and minute. What individuals, first name, last name, right, driver's license, who had access to the infrastructure where my data lives. You're not going to get that in a public cloud. It's almost impossible. Not everyone needs it, but it's a very nice thing to have when an auditor comes in, because you can essentially pull up a mass of information about the entire flow of access from the logical down to the physical. And a private cloud is very conducive to information assurance because you know exactly where your data lives, and you know exactly, depending on your service provider, who has access to it. Here at Lightcrest, we do provide audit trails as to what individuals are on the access list to get into that data, what times were those servers accessed physically and logically. And those are things that are important to have if you're going to maintain a secure HIPAA compliant environment. So we all know that, at least for those of us who are IT veterans, that the more security conscious and compliance conscious we are, the more expensive IT operations get, right? We have to check more boxes, we have to maintain more procedures, we have to maintain more best practices, we have to maintain risk registers, we have to do ongoing audits, we have to, the list goes on. Security is expensive. Private clouds tend to make securing for specific compliance regimes cheaper because you have to deal with less actual incidents, right? Again, you have a much tighter control of your attack surface. You have less abstraction in terms of knowing where your data lives, knowing where your VMs live, knowing whether or not you have to respond to the public cloud, just yanking a VM from under you without any warning. There tends to be less variability in private clouds when it comes to maintaining security policies. It also helps a lot when you're dealing with a services provider in particular that absorbs all the responsibility for the infrastructure side of the risk. That tends to be, there's a lot of cost savings usually in dealing and leveraging the efficiencies that a specialist cloud provider can give you versus doing it in-house. Above and beyond the security side of things with cost, private cloud tends to be just at the infrastructure level much more cost-effective than public cloud. Public cloud is great when you're starting out, but as you scale up, you pay a convenience premium for every virtual machine. So the per unit cost is more expensive in public cloud. The issues where you're dealing with noisy neighbors, stolen CPU cycles, stolen I/O, the situation where in a shared infrastructure environment on a public cloud, you're essentially dealing with less total available computing and storage resources per application because of these noisy neighbors. You have to compensate, right? The way you compensate in a public cloud is you add more VMs. And certainly that can alleviate it to some extent, but that means your costs are going up. So, as you scale up in the public cloud, you're dealing with all those things, and that tends to make public cloud considerably more expensive at scale. The other huge thing to remember about cost with the public cloud is in the public cloud, you are paying rent forever. The whole, concept is pay as you go. In Google, GCE, I pay as I go. AWS and Azure, I only pay for what I need. The problem is, once you establish a certain baseline of traffic, you're always going to need stuff. You're never not going to need stuff. Sure, there might be some volatility. You might have some upswings and downswings, but your fundamental business is growing, and you have a baseline of traffic. You're going to need. You're always going to need infrastructure humming for your steady state workloads, right? Or the applications that are always humming. In those use cases, which are very common, it is much more cost effective to own your cloud because let's say you take a private cloud infrastructure, it's spec'd for 6 years of lifetime. If you can pay that thing off in 2 years, you're essentially rent free for 4. That's a huge cost savings over paying rent for 6 years in total. And we'll talk about some of that stuff in greater detail in a bit. So, can a public cloud be HIPAA compliant, right? I want to be very upfront about this. By no means do I mean to engender the sort of notion that you can't be secure in a public cloud, you can't be HIPAA compliant. You can, it's just more expensive. And there's more concern around lack of control. So AWS, Amazon, God love them. They're working really hard to convince people that they're secure. They have high trust and HIPAA compliance, and other organizations with big IT teams who are passing HIPAA audits on AWS. Yes, absolutely. The question is, will you be tooled to do that in Amazon yourself, and how much is it going to cost you? What tends to happen in the public cloud is, developers start spinning stuff up. It looks so easy. You start getting your application hooked into their APIs, and before you know it, you're reliant on them. You're vendor locked, and then you have to be compliant on their platform. And then you start looking at all the costs associated with, well, what VPCs am I going to use? What AWS expertise am I going to leverage to maintain VPCs? How am I going to handle the situation associated with my neighbors getting compromised and impacting me? How am I going to handle, the transmission of data in between various AWS services, and if that data contains EPHI, how am I going to secure it and lock it down? How am I going to handle offsite backups? All that stuff, right? So there's a lot of homework you're going to have to do if you're thinking about doing HIPAA or maintaining HIPAA compliance in the public cloud. But from our assessment, from what we've looked at, it tends to be a much more expensive and complicated endeavor. And I also want to be very clear about private clouds. Not all private clouds are HIPAA compliant. Private cloud is a infrastructure decision and design. It's about tenancy. It's about single tenancy, dedicated infrastructure. It's about having complete control of your environment. But it's not going to be HIPAA out of the box, right? It's not going to be HIPAA compliant out of the box. You need to, be realistic about this. And when you were considering private cloud as a solution, all those things I just mentioned, the attributes of the infrastructure are great, but you're going to need to really think hard about who's going to help you make it compliant. Are you going to have an in-house team, or are you going to rely on a services provider? So you really need to do your homework. So what makes a private cloud HIPAA compliant? There's no definitive checklist you get from the U.S. Department of Health and Services that once completed, you take all the boxes and take it off your clipboard, hand it to your guy, and he hands it to your auditor. Oh, boom! You take all the boxes, you're done, right? It doesn't work that way. If it were that easy, CPAs would be out of business. The approach is essentially process-driven, and it's about preparation. You need to be in a situation where you're working with folks who've passed HIPAA audits in the past, who've been able to achieve compliance in the past, and who know how to build all the processes and controls around the body of standards necessary to actually pass an audit. Again, there's no list. You can download from the internet and just tick the boxes and say, oh, I'm HIPAA compliant. You need to secure your infrastructure, set up best practices, build a risk register, and then when you've passed the audit, you will have, quote unquote, acted within compliance. As a company like Crest, from a managed services standpoint, this is what we tell our customers from day one in the sales cycle, right? We say, look, we're going to architect you a private cloud. Your private cloud, intrinsically has the capability to be very, very secure and adhere to HIPAA compliance regime. But we need to work with you to understand where do your applications, how do you live in the environment? How do they fit together? Where are you using application level encryption? Where are you using system level encryption? What is the flow of EPHI? What does it look like? Where are the keys stored in your application? Where are the credentials stored? Those kinds of things. And it needs to be a holistic approach because it's going to be completely dependent on your application infrastructure. It's not going to be a sort of binary thing where you can flip a switch and all of a sudden you're ready to go. So I want to talk a little bit about specific attributes of private cloud and how they are conducive to HIPAA and ways that we can maybe drill down to some of those details. So information assurance is key to your cloud environment if you're going to be under audit. And part of information assurance is physical architecture, right? Where is your data located? Who physically has access to the data? How is data destroyed when data is no longer needed? Is there a documented procedure for destroying hard disks and USB drives and anything storage related? What is the process for adding and removing people to the data center access list? These are all things that you're going to want to be able to present to an auditor. Are there offsite backups? Where are they physically located? What rack and what cabinet and what cage are they located? What grade data center? Tier 3, Tier 4? Is there SSA 16 Type 2? Is there ISO compliance? Right. So physical architecture is going to be huge. And from a HIPAA standpoint, I want to be clear about this too. yes, it's going to be great if you build a private cloud and you can show your auditor exactly, here's the physical, here's the architecture diagram for the physical cloud footprint. Here's the architecture diagram for the logical cloud footprint. Here's how all the security components flow together. Here's where the VPNs live. That's all great stuff. But from a business development standpoint, if you're in the business of working with business associates or covered entities, or if you're fundamentally selling to people who are dealing with EPHI, you're going to want to be able to show them some really great credentials around the data center itself, right? Can you give them a data center tour and actually show them how secure this darn thing is, right? Can you show them the man traps, the biometric hand scanners? Can you show them surveillance cameras? We recently had a customer who was required HIPAA compliance, whose customers all were covered entities. They mandated that not only did they need surveillance of the data center itself, they wanted surveillance of the cloud servers, right? The actual hypervisors. That's something you're not going to get in a public cloud. That takes a certain level of customization. So that not only helped them adhere to their own standards for HIPAA, but that helped them win business, right? Because they're able to go to their clients and say, look, we have infrastructure that is way more surveyed and secure than our competitors, and here's a list showing you how we've done that, right? So it's not just about compliance; it's also about winning business in a competitive landscape where your customers require HIPAA compliance, and you want to be able to show them, you've gone the whole 9 yards and then some. So a little bit about logical architecture. The logical architecture, right, is essentially the virtual machines that are deployed on your physical hypervisors. It's the flow of traffic and data, in terms of where the VPNs and the DMZs live, how data is transferred between your applications and the components that live in your private cloud, and the actual sort of workflow of how does data get from point A to point B, how is it stored, how is it backed up, etc. In the most simplistic level, you could sort of say, well, cloud is supposed to be just, it's on demand. I run my applications, and as long as I secure my guest OS and I patch regularly, I should be okay. And if I use SSL and HTTPS, I should be okay. Yeah, that helps, but there's a lot of detail you need to be concerned about when it comes to transmitting EPHI, specifically for HIPAA, right? So things you need to consider are, at any point, if my EPHI is not transmitted if my EPHI is transmitted in plain text anywhere, where is that happening, right? If it's not being encrypted. If it's happening over the wide area network or the public internet, that's pretty bad, right? You're having a hard time passing an audit if you are sending EPHI over vanilla HTTP, even if it's within your own private VLANs, right? So you want to identify all those things, and you want to see where can I minimize my attack surface such that even if one of my developers makes a mistake and say pushes the wrong code to the wrong server, and that server starts harboring EPHI data, how can I make it such that if that happens, all the actual transmission endpoints are still encrypted, right? There has to be a top-down approach to that. You need to be using SSL. You need to be using application encryption from the top down, right? And you also need to be worried about how is my data being transmitted on my back-end VLANs for things like storage and backups. If I have a storage area network and I have a dedicated VLAN for performance reasons, do I have credentials associated with my mount points? If I have EPHI data on a distributed file system or a scale-out storage system, Do I have to authenticate to mount those mount points, or can anybody in the network do it? Is my data being encrypted at rest? Do I ever store EPHI unencrypted on disk? If so, where does it live and does it stay there, right? So things of that nature need to be analyzed and taken into account. And so when you're looking at cloud architectures, you know, it's not going to be, you're not going to be able to stop at just, well, you know, I've got firewalls. It's not enough. And if your application developers don't have big security backgrounds, you know, they might have strong development skills, but they might not, you know, they might not necessarily have a deep security background and not really they might not have hardened your application to the extent it needs to be. So this is something where it really helps to work with an MSP who's done this stuff before, because it can really cut down the amount of work you have to redo in order to pass an audit. So management and administrative controls. Nothing says I'm prepared to your auditor better than a proper risk register and a set of standard operating procedure docs for administrating your cloud infrastructure, right? You know, yes, your infrastructure itself has to be secure, physically, logically, etc., but you want to be able to also produce documents showing that you've actually analyzed the entire landscape, your environment, you've looked at your entire attack surface, and you've cataloged all your risks, whether they be related to application vulnerabilities, or RTO and RPO, or DDoS, or whatever it is. You want to be able to document all these things and measure yourself objectively as best you can against them, and be able to produce that and say, look, this is where we've determined we're strong and we're okay and we're weak, and we're working on the areas that we're not so strong and where we're weak. And ideally, if you can keep these as living, breathing documents, your job just gets easier over time because they're sort of cumulative, right? The risk register might start out small, but as you start passing around the different teams, whether your dev team, your operations team, if you have an MSP, you're passing your MSP, it starts kind of growing organically, and then it's kind of like that old saying, there's only one way to eat an elephant, one piece at a time. Well, if you have enough folks looking at the thing, it's going to get eaten pretty quickly, and those documents, as they mature over time, are only going to help you in future preparations for audits, because you will have your sort of own center of excellence for maintaining administrative control over your own bespoke environment. And these documents are never, ever the same across organizations, right? I mean, folks have different application stacks, they have different application runtimes, they have different deployment methods, different repositories for their apps, GitHub and internal GitLab, etc. These are all things that are going to it's going to be kind of tough when you start, but once you get that done with that initial hump, you're going to end up with a body of documents that are really going to make your life easier in preparation for an audit. And here at Lightcrest, what we really like to help our customers with is the infrastructure side of that equation, right? Helping developers identify all the workflows for deploying applications, helping our customers build best practices around maintenances, helping them build best practices around how they do how they execute security change, right? So if they need to make a change to a firewall DMZ, or if they need to make a change to their ACLs on their virtual machines or their cloud fabric, these are all procedures that are well documented for them. So again, when it comes time for an audit, they're not starting from scratch. So we talked a little bit about this already, but I wanted to dive a bit into physical controls. So when it comes to actually getting physical access to infrastructure, you can get really, really hardcore at this stuff, and it really depends on your end customer, and it really depends on the vertical you happen to be in. But there's a lot to there's a big reason to consider private cloud when you're thinking about when I'm approaching a customer and I want to tell them that I've taken physical security absolutely seriously. How being able to take that to the sort of level of I can show a client that not only do I have key code access controls, biometric hand scanning controls, but I can actually say, we've built, cabinet door covers with PIN codes, and we've got, 24/7 security guards patrolling the environment, things like that. You're not going to really be able to get that from a public cloud, right? And not everyone needs it for a private cloud either, but I mean, the fact that you can sort of bespoke tune the physical controls for a private cloud is huge, because you're going to be able to go to customers and essentially say, look, I can outperform the competition from a security standpoint because I've got X, Y, and Z at the physical layer as well. Will your auditor fail you for HIPAA? Will you fail HIPAA compliance if you don't have, a camera sitting in front of your servers, if you don't have cabinets, closed door cabinets in every single private cloud rack? Maybe you won't fail the audit, but it certainly won't hurt when you're in the sales cycle with customers who have sensitive data, because these are things that your competition in the public cloud cannot do these things, right? So if I'm selling EMR record management applications to somebody, and I can go in and tell them, look, yeah, obviously our application's great. You've already demoed it, it's fast, makes your life easier, more efficient, et cetera. But I can also say, you can go to your patients and your customers and say, this is how hardcore our security is. We've got randomized PIN codes in all the cabinets and all the cloud infrastructure. We've got, time-stamped, personnel access logs. We've got, security personnel all around the data center on a 24/7 basis. That stuff definitely helps, and it's something that you want to consider when you're looking at the opportunity of deploying on a private cloud. So network controls. Network controls are huge because the easiest way to cut down the workload you're going to have to do, or the cut down on the work you're going to have to do to prepare for a HIPAA audit, is maintain a strict network perimeter and strict network controls. You can do all the guest OS level security you want, all the application security you want. If you have weak network controls, your attack surface is going to be huge, right? And this is something that you are really going to have to think about from a public cloud versus private cloud standpoint, in the sense that when you're on public cloud, by default, all your VMs are on the publicly routed internet. If you log into AWS and you launch 10 VMs, they're all going to have public IPs. Can you secure them on VPCs? Yes, but now you're going to have to hire someone who manages VPCs, and you're going to have to deal with automating IP tables replication for securing down all your virtual machine firewalls. It's a very different environment to maintain network security. In a private cloud, you have much more room for error from a developer VM deployment standpoint, right? Like, for example, in Lightcrest private cloud environments, by default, implicitly, all the VLANs are on private RFC 1918 address space. Nothing can get out, nothing can get in. If a developer accidentally spins up a virtual machine with the wrong applications running or the wrong services running, doesn't matter. I mean, obviously, you want to avoid it, but if they launch, Java Tomcat on port 8443, well, fine. Nothing can get to it. You can't route packets directly to your private cloud. It's on a private subnet, private set of subnets and VLANs. So when you're thinking about future liabilities and you're thinking about, well, maybe I don't want to hire internal ops people, I want to hire dev people, and there's risks associated with that. They may not be as, DevOps oriented, and might be spinning up, might make some mistakes from time to time. You won't have to worry as much about, well, my security is going to be compromised by a mistake, right? So network control is going to be much more tunable in a private cloud. And when you start to look at things like dedicated VLANs and the elimination of noisy neighbors on the dedicated VLAN, yes, technically on a public cloud you've got VXLAN, but they're not really VLANs. You're not on dedicated ports either. Your private cloud is much more conducive to dedicated network segments. You've also got the ability to do things like custom two-factor authentication on dedicated firewalls. You can co-locate custom assets like dedicated Cisco ASAs or firewalls or checkpoint firewalls. You can also do things like store your credentials in bespoke hardware-based key systems. These are things that you can't really do well in a public cloud. So what we tell customers off the bat usually when it comes to network security is you're going to have a lot less work to do if you take network security very seriously and you're very strict about it from the get-go. Because if you have a very let's say you only have two entry points into your private cloud, a load balancer VIP and a couple NATs onto your firewall. Those are the only entry points you're really going to have to be concerned about when you're looking at securing the network perimeter, when you're looking at passing an audit and showing them what you've done to do that. So, when it comes to cutting costs and making the actual preparation, less of a burden on your team, having a very strict network policy set is going to be huge. So let's talk a little bit about cloud controls. So the beauty of the cloud, whether it's public or private, is this notion of on-demand deployment and elasticity where you can log into a web portal, push a button, and out pops 10 VMs. Or you can call a REST API endpoint from a script, and out comes an entire set of working application components. This is great, and this was the promise of cloud, right? It's this ease of use and the ability to scale up and down very quickly. The downside of cloud controls is that it is one more place for attackers to break into your environment. And cloud controls is particularly scary when it comes to compromise because it's not just your data that's compromised. Your bill could be just blown out of proportion on the public cloud. We had a customer recently come from AWS to Lightcrest because there was a credential leak. One of their developers either leaked the credentials or accidentally misplaced them. They don't know how it was leaked. But their administrative cloud portal at AWS was compromised, and not only did their VMs get compromised, which is a huge no-no, right? Because as soon as if your cloud interface gets compromised, you can boot into single user mode on your VMs. You can compromise those, but you can also spin up just 100 virtual machines, right? I mean, what these folks tend to do when they break into your cloud portal is spin up more infrastructure so they can run their botnets and their other automated attack tools. And that's very expensive when that happens, and your public cloud provider is not going to be very forgiving. They don't care. They'll happily take your money. So it's essential that when you're leveraging these technologies, whether it's private or public, that you are taking the cloud access portal credential management very seriously because it's essentially a multiplier. It provides a multiplier effect for attackers. So private cloud, there's a couple great things about it when it comes to this. One is, in the event of God forbid, a compromise of your cloud portal, and this will vary depending on the vendor, but long and short of it is you have a finite set of physical resources associated with this. So if they spin up a bunch of VMs, you're going to have a bad day, but you're not going to spin up more VMs than you have infrastructure. And depending on the model, you're not going to have an increase in cost. At Lightcrest, we take very, very strict and stringent steps towards making sure that credentials to portals are limited to specific tenancies. So we minimize the probability of your cloud portal being compromised, particularly as it pertains to production. However, if it were to happen, there's no cost for the additional virtual machines, right? Going back to our cost conversation, in a public cloud, you pay for every single VM you spin up, right? Every virtual machine you spin up costs you money in the public cloud. In the private cloud, you only pay for the underlying resources. So you have a much smaller financial exposure when it comes to superfluous virtual machines being spun up as a result of the compromise. As it pertains specifically to HIPAA, this is going to be something that your auditor is going to look at. This is going to be just, this is going to be a first-class citizen when it comes to the hierarchy of your risks, and this should be part of your risk register. How are you securing and transmitting credentials to your cloud portal? Does your cloud portal support tenancies? I don't mean multiple organizations in this case. I mean, can you carve up your private cloud into separate, isolated bags of resources, such that if your developers log in, they cannot impact production, they can't compromise production. And if they leak their credentials, their credential leak is only going to result in that tenancy being potentially compromised. Things like that. And you want that kind of stuff. At Lightcrest, part of our Kahu product, one of the key things that we drive in the Cloud Administrative Portal is that concept of user tenancies, so that they're isolated from each other. And you're also going to need to look at things like, how often are you rotating your credentials for the cloud portal? Who's managing that? Who's maintaining that? And if you don't have a big ops team, you should probably think about leveraging an MSP on top of your private cloud to do that for you, because if you're lax about that, it can be very, very costly. So business continuity and disaster recovery are at the heart of any enterprise cloud strategy. If you don't properly secure your data, your offsite backup strategy may represent violation of HIPAA standards in the sense that, yeah, great, you've got your private cloud, it's secure, all the boxes are ticked, you went through all the risk register and you went through all the hard work you did to get your private cloud secure, but if you're shipping backups offsite, which is something that many folks who deal with infrastructure that's under a HIPAA compliant regime, or dealing with EMR records, et cetera, they have multiple data centers or they have multiple availability zones. Dealing with offsite backups is going to extend the risk register into other data center environments. So you really need to think about when data is being transmitted between two facilities or two disparate cloud providers, how is that being handled? Are incremental backups being encrypted? Is the data being stored on a shared or a dedicated server? If that data is being stored on a server that's shared with other customers, it needs to be encrypted. Is the data being processed by an intermediary such that it's not going straight from the applications to the backup server, but there's an intermediary service that's compressing the data first? Is that service shared, right? So these are all things that you need to take into account. At Lightcrest, what we tend to do with our customers is say, if you want offsite backups, there are ways to achieve it without violating your HIPAA compliance that are still cost effective, right? And so, if you went for a private cloud for your fundamental baseline infrastructure, you can deploy a mirrored set in a secondary data center. If you can't, if that's not in your budget, you can look at things like third-party public cloud, which tends to be very cost-effective for specific levels of RPO and RTO. But you need to think about that, right? I mean, you need to make sure that if you're going to go that route, do you have an MSP that's going to secure both that third-party public cloud and your private cloud, or are you going to do it yourself? Because if you're going to do it yourself, you better have expertise in both environments, and that tends to be very expensive to maintain in-house. So I want to speed up a little bit, and I just want to talk about some things that you should be aware of as you're kind of evaluating the landscape and selecting a vendor, perhaps, or technology to serve as the basis for your infrastructure, and perhaps your the service provider you might leverage to get you into a HIPAA compliant state. Beware of the term compliance as a service. A lot of infrastructure vendors sort of claim this, turnkey cloud environment that it's compliant out of the box. It's compliance as a service. You pay us, money comes in every month, and out comes a compliant cloud every month. It's just not the case. Infrastructure vendors, by definition, are not, the third-party CPA firm that's going to come in and audit the thing, right? The only person that's going to come in and say that your infrastructure is actually compliant is that third-party, CPA or auditing firm that says you've done all the right things. So do not pay a premium for quote-unquote compliance as a service. It's just not. You're not going to get it. There's a lot of vendors out there that are security focused, quote-unquote, and they've got these sort of fancy dashboards where you slide your credit card and you get your virtual machines and there's a chart of sort of your security exposure, but you're not HIPAA compliant. You're not going to be able to pass your audit the next day. And if you're paying a premium for that, you're kind of throwing your money away. And the other thing you need to sort of be aware of is having your vendor bring in a compliance officer or a purported expert and say, you guys are an environment that is very, very compliant. You're ready to go, right? A lot of these folks are going to say that the infrastructure is behind firewalls, you've got DMZs, and the data is on a dedicated backup server, and you're HIPAA compliant. And it's not necessarily going to be as compliant as you think. And I don't mean just the fact that it's not turnkey. I mean also that if they give you an architecture diagram that shows your traffic flows, that might not be true. And so it's really important that you have the ability to be transparent with your vendor and get things like, if I want to see a photograph of my servers, send them to me. If I want to see my switch fabric configurations, right? If I want to see down to the, if you have shared firewalls, the firewall ACL lists, the policy-based routing, all that stuff. You need transparency, because if you don't get it and you lock yourself into a two-year contract with one of these folks, and then you go in for an audit, your auditor requests this information, it could be too late, right? You might find things that are wrong with the configuration. You might not get it at all, and then you're going to have to backpedal. So it's very important to get transparency from your vendor, and in the sales cycle early on, ask about ask about the availability of configurations at every level of the infrastructure, every level of the OSI model. The other thing to look out for is information control, right? Are you going to be giving something up by moving to this vendor? Some providers essentially act as a black box. They don't share their network policies with anybody. They don't share their documentation. They don't share, some of them don't even have administrative portals to control the environment. You really want to make sure that you have as much control as possible. Back to our conversation around private cloud, one of the whole reasons of going private cloud above, the cost savings and the performance is you have complete control. The hardware is bespoke and custom. Everything is tunable. You can launch VMs up and down and place them where you need to place them. Information assurance, right? You don't want to give that stuff up. And you need to make sure that you have all the control and capabilities you need, and that you're not giving up deployment and customization capability. Now, when it comes to support, HIPAA doesn't mandate you get great support from your vendor, right? It's not part of the HIPAA body of standards. But if you work with a vendor who's great in security and great with transparency and information assurance and can give you all the security you need, but they have a horrible support platform for the availability of your applications, you're going to be back at square one. You don't want to have to migrate away from a security specialized vendor just because you happen to find out when it was 6 months into the relationship that they weren't responding to tickets, they weren't picking up the phone, your application was going down and they weren't around to fix it, that your application was going down at all, it's a huge red flag, right? The rest of the fundamental components that you would expect from a solid cloud vendor need to be there: high availability, strong support personnel, high performance, strong SLAs. Because if it's not there, you're not going to stay, and you're going to have to reevaluate HIPAA all over again at a new vendor. So you really want to take a holistic approach. So cost is obviously a big sticking point, and it changes so much across cloud vendors that it's mind-boggling, right? I mean, AWS has their own cost calculator, Rackspace has their own cost calculator, and I don't know if you guys have ever seen a Microsoft Azure bill, but it is like deciphering Morse code with zero background in Morse code. It's insane. So it can be very expensive, and particularly in public cloud, this sort of pay-as-you-go model, you often don't find out until after you've migrated how expensive it really is. So just do your homework and make sure that you fully understand the implications of cost. Because again, if you work with a provider and the security looks great and you think you're going to pass a HIPAA audit, that's all fine and well. But if it turns out to be not cost effective, you're going to have to go through that whole rigmarole again. You don't want to have to do that. It's just a huge pain. At Lightcrest, we pride our product Kahu on being very simple from a pricing and financing standpoint. If you guys are ever interested in seeing how Kahu might stack up against AWS or Azure, it really helps through working with a platform where you can plan your entire infrastructure budget on the back of a napkin. That's how simple it is. So just keep that in mind. So what can you do now? Look, so you might be in the market for a vendor, you might not be. From a managed cloud standpoint, HIPAA may or may not be on your roadmap, but if it could be, you want to start looking around early, and you want to start doing your homework, because there are a lot of things to consider. And at Lightcrest, one of the founding principles of our firm is essentially that software companies have enough challenges on their plate. Going to market, getting product market fit, building an awesome application, getting customers, getting revenue, that's all really hard to do on their own. Dealing with the infrastructure side of things, especially once you bring HIPAA into the fold, can be just very daunting and very expensive. So you might want to think early on about working with a vendor where you can essentially partner with them to get the security and HIPAA compliance pieces, at least for the infrastructure side, outsourced. Right, you essentially rely on an expert to do it at a fraction of the cost, and that's why a lot of our customers come to us from the public cloud or from other boutique cloud vendors. And you want to think of your cloud provider as a partner, right? So rather than a black box of virtual machines and virtual storage and maybe a couple of help tickets once in a while, you really want to work with somebody as an extension of your team. Most cloud vendors do not work this way. Amazon Web Services does not really care about your application availability. They don't really care about your security implementation. They don't care about mitigating your DDoS attacks. And this is not to say that they're a bad company. I mean, they have a different model. They have a utility-based model where you consume as much as you want, you can consume in bulk, but it's really up to you to secure it and manage it. If you have a smaller, medium-sized business, this may not be conducive to your org chart, right? And you're going to want to work with somebody who's an extension of your team. At Lightcrest, part of our FSE division, again, that's our full stack engineering services, we have this concept of YPE, which stands for Your Personal Engineering. And what that is essentially a pod of engineers and architects that we extend and assign to your account. So you essentially have an extension of your team and a group of engineers that are managing all that stuff for you. So, that model is only, it's only going to work in a company that's tooled in a way to provide that. The public clouds are just not. So, really do your homework and make sure you find a vendor that's going to work with you if your org chart is not staffed to do that stuff. And make sure you get a solution that's bespoke, right? You know, the great thing about private cloud infrastructure is that you can oversubscribe your own environment. You can scale VMs up and down without drastically increasing the size of your bill. And you can tune the underlying hardware components for specific applications. Unlike the public cloud where, you know, yes, there's many virtual machine sizes and types, but you are locked into their menu, right? There's a set amount of you know, AWS VM flavors, and there's a couple different types of storage. They have very static pricing, and you're just, that's what you get, right? And so you kind of have to mold your application to them. In a private cloud, it's much more the cloud conforms to your applications. So just make sure that as you're evaluating a landscape that you really take into account vendors who can provide you with bespoke infrastructure. Our cloud product, Kahu, is essentially a software-defined private cloud platform, and all of our Kahu bricks, which are the fundamental building blocks of the Kahu computing fabric, are bespoke and built custom to your application, which is why we can, so excessively outperform AWS on I/O, and why we can so excessively outperform public clouds in general when it comes to vCPU density and getting the highest V to P ratios in terms of physical to virtual to physical CPUs. So this stuff really counts, especially as you grow, because that's not only going to increase your performance, but it's going to decrease your costs because you can fit more virtualized workloads into the same footprint. And we didn't talk too much about hybrid cloud on this call, but I do want to mention that it's something that you want to look at, and it can give you the best of both worlds. There's this concept of what we call owning your valleys and renting your peaks, right? So with a private cloud, you can own your valleys. In other words, your steady state traffic loads, what you kind of do on average, or 80% of the time you're pushing, half a 500 megabit, and your load averages are stable, et cetera, your standard base traffic load. If 80% of the time you're doing that, that's your valley. You want to be able to own that, right? You want to own the infrastructure that provides for that, because that's how you get rid of your costs. But if you do have some volatility where you go from 500 megabit to a gigabit, or your traffic explodes seasonally, whatever, you can still burst into third-party public clouds, and that gives you the sort of ability to rent your peaks, right? And this model is it's undisputed, undisputable. This is the most cost-effective way of running cloud, but it's also more complex, and it also has implications when it comes to HIPAA, because as soon as you start bursting into a public cloud, your security practices need to extend into that environment, and that needs to be accounted for in your audit. So while there's a lot of economic efficiencies to be gained in a hybrid cloud, you're going to want to work with a vendor that can maintain your help you maintain your compliance adherence across both environments. Okay, so that's pretty much all I had for today. I do want to say thank you for everyone who joined the call and joined the webinar. If you guys have any questions, I have a little questions box here in the GoTo webinar panel, so feel free to ask any questions, and thank you for joining us. Okay, so does anybody have any questions? Okay, one question is, how do you handle network security in a private cloud compared with something like Amazon VPC? Great question. So Amazon VPC is essentially a way to get private RFC 1918 address space and you know what looks like a VLAN on a public cloud. The actual implementation is proprietary to AWS. Ostensibly, if you set up a VPC in AWS and you try to sniff traffic outside of your VPC, you're not going to see anything but your own traffic. The most comparable thing to that in a private cloud is dedicated VLANs. The nice thing about private cloud infrastructure is that there's no limitation on how many 802.180 how many actual 802.1q VLANs can I set up. You can set up as many as you want. In our environments, we generally have a completely segregated L2 public segment, and we have a dedicated VLAN and dedicated private IP subnet for each customer. For folks that are in need of HIPAA compliance, we typically set up additional VLANs, such as storage VLANs for all file storage, and that is really conducive to strong security best practices because you don't have sensitive EPHI data flowing in the same direction as your public-facing interfaces on your virtual machines, the ones that are facing your load balancer bits. But yeah, essentially, our equivalent of Amazon VPC would just be software-defined 802.1q VLANs. Any other questions? Next question is, do you support encryption at rest? Yeah, so our product Kahu is essentially our hyper-converged software-defined cloud platform, and Kahu provides a multitude of ways of deploying storage, whether it's local or distributed. Kahu does support encryption at rest, so if you want to back your data up and have the data be encrypted on disk, that's certainly something that Kahu can accommodate, and we also provide encryption at rest in the underlying guest VMs. Next question. I run a company that stores a ton of EMR data. How does private cloud scale for this use case? Great question. So EMR is a huge use case for HIPAA deployments. So there's a couple ways to approach the problem, but if you have consistent consistently growing data set for EMR, lots of little files, and you're on a pretty strong growth trajectory, we recommend our Kahu scale-out storage solution. So Kahu, being hyperconverged, provides both scale-out network compute and storage. And the way it works is when you deploy your Kahu bricks, we allocate a replicated set of bricks for scale-out data storage, and you scale the storage linearly as you add bricks. So if your EMR data, say, has 6 terabytes and growing, we can set it up such that a pair of Kahu bricks or in triplicate, 3 nodes, is providing you with the high availability and redundancy of that data, right? So if any one node goes down, the data is still available without interruption. You take that and you essentially scale that out linearly as data corpus increases. So you can add more nodes horizontally to add redundancy. You can add more nodes vertically to scale for data capacity increases. But if you have any, if you want to see any examples of that, we can set up a separate discussion and show you the ins and outs of it. Next question. How do you recommend handling offsite backups in a HIPAA compliant environment? That's a great question. So it depends on the solution. If you are looking at a hybrid cloud environment where your offsite backups are going into a third-party public cloud, typically this is to optimize for cost and not performance. But if you do that, the thing that you want to make sure of is that your EPHI is encrypted before it leaves your data center. You don't want to make sure that you don't want to just assume that you're popping data in S3 and that your developers are going to encrypt it for you. If they make mistakes and it's not encrypted, then you violated the violated the best practices. So typically what we do is for public cloud offsite backups, we encrypt all data locally first and we transmit that into dedicated virtual machines, and they're not ideally they're dedicated hosts. If they're not, the next best thing is just encrypting them before you put them into object storage. If you don't use hybrid cloud or a third-party public cloud for this, you can set up a mirrored Kahu infrastructure in one of our secondary facilities on the East Coast, and then we manage offsite data synchronization between those facilities. And obviously, as we drill down into your environment, we learn where your EPHI lives, where you need encryption at rest, and what the RTO and RPO targets are for that data. Cool. Any more questions? All right, guys. Well, I think that pretty much sums it up. If there's any other questions after the webinar, feel free to reach out to us directly. You can reach out to me or just our contact email address on the website or our website form. We'd love to learn more about your challenges and your environments. We're looking forward to our next webinar. So thank you for carving out the time today, and good luck with your endeavors.